Hello, today I'd like to talk about some of the significant book experiences that I've had that weren't necessarily positive, but are very notable when I think back over my reading. The first experience is about The Red Badge of Courage, an episode of the American Civil War by Stephen Crane. I was assigned to read this book in school in 2014, and the first time I read it, I absolutely hated it. I thought the writing was impenetrable. I didn't understand most of what was going on. It's very lyrical and intentionally hazy to impart what the blur of war is actually like. And that meant that I really hated it. I thought the writing was terrible. I didn't understand what it was actually trying to do, and I was very frustrated by it. But then when we actually started discussing it in class, the teacher walked through a number of the chapters and read out passages and paused and really discussed the symbolism and what each sentence meant and what Stephen Crane was actually trying to do. After those first few classes, I decided to reread it, and it was like reading with new eyes. I suddenly could understand and see the writing. I felt like it was a different book, and I started underlining and jotting notes in the margins, and it's actually the book that I have annotated the most heavily of anything that I've ever read or studied. I've never had such a clear distinction between lack of comprehension turning into comprehension. I've had teachers or online videos discuss aspects of a book that I hadn't ever thought about before or show a different side to a novel, but nothing quite like this. It was like night and day before and after, and I think it was a huge step in my reading comprehension and analytical capabilities. It made a certain type of novel and a certain type of writing that I always thought would be out of my reach become approachable. The second significant experience involves A Little Life by Hanya Yanagihara. In 2015, I travelled around Europe by myself. It was a solo trip, and I had lots of time to read and listen to audiobooks. And when I arrived in Amsterdam, I began listening to A Little Life on audiobook. And to be perfectly honest, I don't really like this book very much. It seems really emotionally manipulative and overwrought, and I actually felt uncomfortable as it seemed the author herself derived some form of satisfaction in administering abuse upon abuse onto the main character. However, it was also incredibly addictive, and even though I wasn't enjoying it and I was critical of the writing, I was also compelled to just keep listening, and despite it being an incredibly long book and the longest audiobook I've ever listened to, I not only finished it, I read it very quickly. I basically listened to this book for 3 days straight while I was in Amsterdam, and my hostel was right beside the famous Amsterdam park where I walked basically every day, and I have such strong memories of listening to this book as I walked around the wintry park and all around Amsterdam. So despite being highly critical of the book itself, I have all of these really strong, fond associations with it, and it feels a bit bizarre, and it causes me a bit of cognitive dissonance sometimes when I think about this book. Next is about the true crime book Helter Skelter by Vincent Bugliosi. When I started reading this book, I put some instrumental music on in the background, which is something that I do sometimes when I read. And I heard this particular song, and for whatever reason, it just clicked with this book. And that song was There's No Time Like Now by Utopian Sounds, which I will link in the description. And it's this really relaxing, gentle instrumental tune, but it's also quite uplifting. That might seem to conflict, like how can that possibly fit with a book about the Manson murders? But the reason why it felt fitting to me is because Helter Skelter is written from the perspective of the prosecuting lawyer, and for the majority of the book it follows his time trying to acquire solid evidence proving Charles Manson was guilty of these murders, even though he wasn't actually the person who committed them himself. So the uplifting tone of this music felt fitting to this narrative of striving for justice and working towards truth and reason. I ended up replaying the song over and over while I read the rest of the book, which further deepened the association between the two. This was the first time such a strong link was made in my brain between a singular song and a particular book, but that has happened a number of times since then. And I'm thinking about actually making a separate video about different music and book pairings I've had, but this book and this song was the first time that that had ever happened to me. The last experience I'd like to talk about is around the book called I'll Be Gone in the Dark by Michelle McNamara. I read this book at the beginning of 2018, and I was no stranger to true crime, having read a few of them before, including Helter Skelter, and I had never had any adverse effects. I'd always been able to handle reading true crime with absolutely no problem. And then I read this, and it gave me some of the worst anxiety and terrible insomnia that I have ever experienced. Firstly, I had to stop reading the book at night, and I could only read it in very short chunks during the day. And secondly, it triggered something in me, and I began to really struggle going to sleep for a number of months after finishing this book. It was something that I've never experienced before or since. I've never had a book have such a significant impact on my actual day-to-day life before. And I feel really bad because this book is excellently written, and I so wish that Michelle had been able to complete it. But I hesitate to recommend it to anyone because it resulted in such a negative outcome for me. It ended up changing my whole relationship with true crime, and I hadn't actually felt comfortable enough to read another true crime book until just recently. Looking back at the true crime books that I had read prior to this one, I realized that I had never actually read a book that involved home invasion or a serial rapist or even a serial killer before this. I'd only read true crimes of other categories. And I realized that that subgenre of true crime that involves home invasion or serial killers is really not for me. It's actually made me think a lot about the different subgenres of true crime, and I'm also thinking about making a separate video about that. So they are some of the significant book experiences I've had. Often when we talk about books that we've read, we focus on what we liked or didn't like, but there's a whole lot of context around when and how we read that plays a huge role in the overall experience of reading a book. Let me know if you've had any experiences like this yourself. Thank you for watching.